Welcome everyone to my YouTube channel. I'm International Master William Paschall. This is Video Chess Training, and we're going to take a look at a Grandmaster chess game from Leuven, the Grand Chess Tour. This is a rapid game, and the opponents are Vachier-Anand playing white, Anand playing black. Topical opening we have here: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6. If you don't know already, this so-called Berlin defense is the bane of the player playing white in the Ruy Lopez these days. The problem being that if white castles, knight takes e4, the main line with d4 is a difficult variation. After knight to d6, bishop takes c6, d takes c, d takes e5, knight f5. This ending after queen takes d8, king takes d8 has been proven to be very, very difficult for white to prove an advantage. It has been proven difficult for white to prove an advantage here, and time and time again it has been very, very problematic. So a lot of players are exploring other options. If we go back to the Berlin defense here with knight f6, we see Vachier here playing a kind of trendy move at the moment, d3. It's not very exciting, but it's one way to keep the pieces on the board and try to play for a small advantage. Black plays bishop c5. He could also play setups like d6 and g6. White plays c3. So you see the position is actually somewhat similar to a Joko piano, just with the bishop on b5 instead of on c4. And we have seen quite a few players playing bishop c4 instead of bishop b5. My kind of take on it is that if you're going to play a setup with d3 and c3, maybe we might as well be playing the Joko piano with white. Seriously, there are some interesting exchange variations going on lately, but the options are really, to go into the main line, to play another opening like the Joko, play one of these exchange variations, for example on c6. Not that many options, and none of which look that appealing for white. So here, Vachier-Anand tries to play kind of a main line in this d3, c3 Lopez. Castles, castles, d6, and now knight on b to d2. Kind of traditional development of the knight. And here, black has a lot of moves, but this one is very popular at the moment, knight e7. And it's interesting because it feels like it's kind of risky. It looks like black is moving away from the center at a pretty early stage with the knight going to e7. And although this is a typical maneuver in the Joko piano, it looks like here white's ready to strike with d4. Black has to surrender the center. After d4, white's double attacking e5 with the pawn and with the knight. So black gives up the center, e takes d4, c takes d4. And to the uninitiated, this may seem like a big problem for black. White has the ideal pawn center now. I agree that it looks like it should be slightly better for white, but actually, if we look a little deeper, I think the issue really is the knight on d2 not being particularly well placed in this type of pawn formation. If it was on c3, it would be much better placed, much more well placed. So here I think that we have some justification, and although the knight could go to somewhere like c4 after bishop b6, next move is bishop b6, we've got to keep the e4 pawn protected. So black kind of keeps white busy with various threats against the center in a kind of hyper-modern type of way. And we have seen quite a few games in this particular variation in recent months. So rook e1 reinforcing e4 and threatening, I guess, something like knight to c4 in some lines. Black develops actively with bishop g4. Vachier plays h3, and now bishop h5, and obviously white could play g4 in this type of position, but there is, there's a fine line where if you play moves like g4, you may be overextending your pawns permanently, so it's not that simple. Here he played the move that's been played in quite a few games, queen b3, getting out of the pin. Although the queen is arguably a little bit artificially placed here. It is getting out of the pin. It has some relatively safe, stable position at the moment. It's difficult to attack it on b3. You could see it attacking b7 down the line at some point, and it has lateral mobility defending f3, attacks f7, so it's not a bad square for the queen actually. And now black establishes the center, his stake in the center with d5, over protected with the two knights, and white plays universally here e5, gaining space. But I think this position has very much to do with pawn structure. So although white has a majority of pawns on the king side, we see in other double king pawn openings like the open Spanish, and although that could be a dangerous advantage if that pawn phalanx is able to advance with f4, f5, there is definitely a downside here for white too. You can see the pawn on d4 is kind of backward and actually easy for black to put pressure on. The bishop on b6 keeping the knight tied down at the moment. So the d4 pawn is the base of white's pawn chain, if you will, and it is a kind of vulnerable spot. So I think that gives black a real basis of counterplay. Knight to d7, it's passive looking, but necessary. And you have to think that the position looks a little like a Caro-Kann now. Black could play c5 at some point to bust out and destroy the white center. So knight to d7, and now here, this position has been reached, I think, at least maybe 15 times or so in master level play. Almost everybody has played a4 here, and this looks like a really good move. Getting the rook in the game, so to speak, from its original square, threatening, very uncomfortable move, a5, maybe just gaining space for white and inducing black to weaken his structure with something like a6 or a5. So a4 looks like the right move. But Vachier played a very strange move here. Queen to d1. I did not understand why you would play queen b3 and then bring the queen back to d1. When I checked in the database, it turns out there was one obscure game which followed this much at least, queen d1 and Anand's rook e8. But it was a game between two relatively weak masters, not really significant. So I don't understand why Vachier played queen d1. It seems very strange to lose time, and maybe he was just a little bit unsure about his plan. It looks like he wants to free b3 for the knight, but obviously this is a strange decision, incorrect, one might argue, to bring the queen back to d1. But anyway, the rest of the game is very instructive. Now after rook e8, he changes tack. He decides to play g4, so the game really starts to look like some kind of open Lopez. Anand plays bishop g6, of course, and now knight b3 might be a good move. Caro-Kann style, advanced Caro-Kann style, knight b3, kind of looking at c5. Also a typical kind of decision point in the Caro-Kann advanced variation. Anand here may be comfortable. I mean, he plays the Slav a lot, and he plays the Caro-Kann too. So I'm thinking Anand with black, absolutely very comfortable in this kind of pawn structure. Now knight f1, again, open Spanish type of move. And here, I think finally the best move from Anand, c6. He overprotects his center on d5. You could definitely try an active move like c5, but I think it's best to play this first no matter what. And now, arguably, the bishop on g6 is very strong. So bishop e2 doesn't look really appealing. Bishop a4 looks out of play. I don't really think there's any argument that bishop d3 here for Vachier is correct. Although generally you have more space, you shouldn't trade pieces. Though that is a general rule. I think in this particular case, bishop d3 looks quite okay. And then Anand here could play c5, but he goes to the much more kind of fundamental break here, f6. And you do see this kind of structure in other lines of like the Petrov or sort of anti-double king pawn systems, some lines of like the three knights I've seen, but this f6 is attacking the head of the pawn chain, which you know, you could say, well, Nimzovich would disapprove because he would prefer to play for c5. But it's really hard for white to support the f6. And another very important thing happens here. Hard for white to support the e5 pawn, I should say, but it's hard for white to maintain the status quo. What happens here, and what's really important in this position strategically, is that it's kind of subtle, but white becomes kind of backwards on the f-file. And this is the theme that really rules the game. So it's interesting here. I mean, it looks like black's weakening his king side, and it looks like white is fairly well developed. They're about equal in terms of development. But the f6, breaking up the pawn on e5, gets this play for black along the f-file. f6, e takes f6, knight takes f6, and now knight to g3. And again, as in the open Lopez, there is this kind of outpost for white on f5. And I suppose that when we talk about the backwardness for white along the f-file, it doesn't look like there's anything happening there at the moment, first of all. But secondly, and in the game, he can kind of block any play black can get along the f-file by posting a piece up on f5. Now Anand, at this point, trades on d3. I think he could have made a developing move here. For example, queen d6 looks like a very solid move for black. So I think it's arguable whether Anand's bishop takes d3 is the best move or not. I mean, queen d6 looks like a very solid move. But Anand is practical and fast, and I guess he thought this is good enough, and he didn't want to waste time trying to find a better move. Queen d6 maybe didn't pop into his mind. Maybe it did. He declined it. I don't know. But bishop takes d3 does help white develop a little bit with tempo. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, getting that queen developed. And only later here I think white makes a mistake. Anand plays knight g6, and the first sign we see of a little bit of activity for black, in this relatively symmetrical looking position, white's now remaining with an isolated pawn on d4. So the king side looks a little bit overextended with g4, and the pawn on d4 is now concretely isolated. So knight to g6, rook takes e8 check. Now this move, I have to say, was surprising for me. Fundamentally, I don't think that what we want to do normally is to give up control of the open file. Rook takes e8, queen takes e8, and now white has given up control of the open file. His idea is that he can regain it, but I think it would have been better after knight g6 just to simply play a quiet move here, bishop d2. Don't let black, have development for free. I'm not sure what Anand would have done here. Now queen d6, not really good because of knight f5. Queen d7, yeah, probably he would have played something along the lines of queen d7. I'm not really sure, though. Bishop d2, much better than trading on e8. So I think here's where white really starts to go wrong. Rook takes e8. It looks like a very minor thing, but rook takes e8 check, queen takes e8, and then this sort of artificial developing move, bishop g5. It looks active, but it doesn't really do anything except force black to choose the right plan, which is queen f7. And something you would see, looks like something you would see in a Berea French defense type position. Queen f7 usually square in some lines of the French. So rook e1 now, getting the file again, but it's too late because now Anand doesn't care about the e file. He has other business on the f file, and that's the point. That's the backwardness where white is going to have problems along the f file. It happens pretty fast here. I mean, it looked all very innocuous, but black is collecting strategic advantages. I mean, the first one is the isolated pawn on d4. He destroyed the strong point on e5. Now the d4 pawn is isolated. White has overextended his king side slightly with the move g4. Now there's a backwardness along the f file, and white's control of the e file isn't really relevant. There doesn't seem to be anything he can do. He hasn't cut black off from coordinating or stopped him from getting his pieces over to the f file. So the e file seems kind of irrelevant here. But I guess Vachier thought, well, I can just block it up with knight f5, no big deal. Okay, so this is what happens. Knight f5 here, blocking black's counterplay along the f file. But Vichy has here knight e4. Now, if we go back for a minute, by the way, one move, I wanted to point out something. Instead, after move rook e1, instead of rook f8 here, Anand has a very interesting try. He immediately has play with the move knight e4. This was an interesting try. Knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and whichever way white recaptures here, with the queen or with the rook, it doesn't seem to matter. It looks like in all lines, black has huge play. Check this out. Rook takes e4, rook f8. This didn't happen. This is analysis, but it looks to me like white's in a lot of trouble. Rook takes e4, rook f8, and I don't see a good move for white here. He actually has to maybe drop the f2 pawn with check. Or, for example, rook e3, his bishop has nowhere to go. h6, and black's probably winning. So, Vichy at this point, he could have also faced queen takes e4, but same thing, rook f8. So instead of actually playing rook f8, I think Anand could have played knight e4 right away. But the difference probably isn't that great because it would have possibly transposed to the same position anyway. Rook f8, knight f5, knight e4. Here we are. The knight jumps in there, and now we're hitting the bishop on g5. And at this point, I don't know what to recommend. For white, he could have tried maybe bishop d2. It looks like a strange move, but it might hold on. He plays instead active move, bishop h6. I think it's okay, but he has to find a computer variation here. I think white would really have to find a perfect move to stop black. Anand has an unbelievable move at this point, which is sort of like only move actually, so I'm not surprised he found it. But for a mere mortal, this would have been an accomplishment. To see this line in advance now. Queen c7. This is an absolute brilliancy. It looks kind of weird, like you're just going away to the other side of the board, but you've got this line from h2 to c7. And you'll see the point here in a minute. Obviously, knight takes g7 would look a little bit dangerous. So bishop takes g7, and this is rook takes f5 is possible, for example. A lot of variations. Bishop takes g7, knight f4 is also an interesting line that's very dangerous for white. So yes, I mean knight takes g7, knight takes f2, and this is what Anand had seen. So I think, obviously, Vachier saw this, but he missed something a little bit later in the combination. The pressure down the f-file ends up winning for black. Knight takes f2, king takes f2, and now queen h2 check. And my assumption is that in his previous analysis, Vachier saw this, but maybe missed the move bishop takes d4 check in his calculations. Because after queen h2 check, king e3, this quiet move may have been overlooked by Vachier. Queen g2. Black is down a piece, and you're usually looking at very aggressive moves in this kind of position, but rook e8 doesn't work. There's nothing with the bishop on b6. Doesn't seem to be a powerful knight move for black. So this quiet move, queen g2 from Anand, is the real killer. And there doesn't appear to be a resource here for white. So he plays the natural looking move queen e2, and after rook takes f3, queen takes f3, perhaps in his previous calculations he missed bishop takes d4 check. This just wins material for black. Bishop takes d4 check, king takes d4, and queen takes f3, and now black has a queen and a pawn for rook and bishop, which is too much. Knight f5. White almost has some coordination here, but the knight on g6 is able to stop any kind of mating threats by white. So it's a mop-up operation now for Anand. Queen takes f3, bishop takes d4 check, king takes d4, queen takes f3, knight f5, and now queen f2 check, rook e3, queen takes b2, and now the material is just too much, and the king is in trouble. He tries to bring the king in, perhaps play for a mate, but it's just a farce. Queen b6 check, king d6, queen d8 check, king c5, and now d4. And black has stopped all threats. As well, he has his own very powerful threat of queen d5 check now. So white cannot take that pawn on d4 without losing another piece. And it is over. Vachier-Anand resigns here. This was, I thought, an interesting, maybe one of the most interesting and beautiful games from the Grand Chess Tour in Leuven. This was in one of the early rounds, maybe the first round. But I thought a spectacular game by Anand, by far one of the most beautiful, and very interesting strategically, the way he dismantled white with, you know, very subtle little quiet moves, first inducing g4, then breaking the center with f6, bringing everything across for black to the f file, and the very strong player with white just sort of disintegrating tactically. And queen c7 was a really key move. If we go back, I wanted to show you one thing I didn't point out. I should point out here, there was a resource for Vachier that would have held the game. After 25 bishop h6, I forgot to mention, queen c7, he took on g7. This is losing. Knight takes g7. White does have a move. I mean, actually both captures are bad on g7. But white does have a move here. After rook f8, knight f5, knight e4, bishop h6, queen c7. This brilliancy, I think the best move of the game by Anand. White has a computer-like move here to save the game, but it was very hard to find over the board. Queen b3, with the idea of rook takes e4. And honestly, it looks as though this move seems to maintain the balance for white here. But this is the only chance, and again, it's a very, very difficult move to find in this tense position, queen b3 here. Looks like after he doesn't find that, Vachier was in very significant difficulty. Anyway, thanks for joining me here at Video Chess Training on YouTube. I'm International Master William Paschall. This was an exciting game from the Grand Chess Tour in Leuven between Vachier-Anand and Anand. Hope you enjoyed the analysis. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Take care.